I would just like to say that I'll start out with a line by Al Gore. When he was making a presentation, and he said, I feel like Christy Brinkley's fifth husband on his wedding night. I know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure I know how to keep it interesting. That's what I'm going to try to do, is I'm going to try to make it interesting today, because communication starts with the ability to entertain. If you're not listening, if you're bored, you're not going to communicate. So I like to start with that premise. But I would also like to say that it's somewhat ironic that I'm speaking here in the under the aegis of the Center for Justice, because one of my basic tenets is that you never win an argument. By win an argument, I mean to be able to convince somebody of a point of view. Now, having said that, you have to understand and realize that there are two instances of where a decision is actually rendered. And mostly, we're talking about courts of law and debates. So if a debate is done and there is a decision rendered, well, then as a matter of fact, you are making a difference. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about, and I've talked to other lawyers about this circumstance, and the United States adversarial system is not universal throughout the world. And so we're drifting more and more with the smart justice business to a position where we're not rendering a decision, we're not arguing, because arguing, in fact, I spent most of my life arguing. Really like arguments, the excitement and so forth of them. But the issue really here is that most people think that if they could just make the perfect argument, close all of the loopholes in the argument, make everything really sharp and clear, that they can make Rush Limbaugh into a flaming liberal. If you really are concentrating on the business of argument. So I was one of those, and I gave that up a long time ago now. And one thing that convinced me of that was the issue of neuroscience and the modern information about neuroscience. Neuroscience is the study of how the brain works. And so in this period of time, we have turned neuroscience really into hard science with the invention of the fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. Allows us to, actually peer into the brain as it works and to see what centers the interest is from stimulus and response. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's what leads me in this direction. And I'm really concerned about the idea of people actually communicating and doing it well with the idea that argument is not satisfactory, that argument doesn't work if you're trying to persuade and influence people. And when we're talking about that, we're also talking about what we're dealing with is politics. Politics is the art of persuasion and influence. That's what politics is. And so in that sense, we're into a different realm as well. But mostly I'm interested in just personal communication and your ability to influence the people that you try to influence every day of your lives, your boyfriends, your girlfriends, your spouses, et cetera, and the people that you work with in the marketplace. So let's start out by, and by the way, be sure to feel free to interrupt me at any time. I would like to make this as interactive as possible. More like this? Is that better? Okay. I want to be sure to do that. So, the bottom line being that you never win an argument, then we have to say to ourselves, well, then how do you influence and persuade people? And we find that people make decisions not on the basis of logic and reason and knowledge, but people make decisions on the basis of their belief system, the belief system that they have built up over their entire lifetimes. And that makes all the difference in the world, because that is done at a subconscious level, not at a conscious level. And people are making those decisions, and then they think of all of the facts and statistics and quotations and examples and so forth that will back up the decision that they've already made. And that's a crucial point here. We have to understand that the decisions then that we make are at the emotional subconscious level. And that's a very hard sell, because most of the, particularly Democratic candidates and so forth, are much more concerned about facts and statistics and quotations and examples and building up a case and on and on. So if you're talking about trying to affect people's mentality and judgment and so forth without facts and statistics and quotations, etc., then what are your options? And the options, of course, have to do with stories, because we find that stories are the most convincing way to persuade and influence people. And one of the reasons for this is that, first of all, stories make information memorable. And if you're not able to make your information memorable, then what's the point in doing it? It's just a waste of time. So what you try to do is you try to tell stories that illustrate the position that you are taking and that you want people to believe. The next step for that is, what do you do about making it ethical? Because keep in mind that the information that I'm giving you today is nothing new, particularly for the advertising business. Mostly the people from the commercial establishment they were intuitively aware that you do not convince people to buy a product on the basis of facts and statistics. All you have to do is turn on the TV and you can, see all kinds of examples of this where they're appealing to your emotional bias, to your belief system, and they have a pretty good idea of what that belief system is. So, having said that, let's take an example of a story that was, I think, very persuasive, that was, in my judgment, really unethical. At one point in one point of the campaign between McCain and Obama, there was a story going around where they said that a journalist came up to Senator McCain and they said, "Senator, it's finally come down to this. What is it with you, boxers or briefs?" And he said, "Depends." Now, I think that story cost him 1.5 million votes at least. It's a funny story. It's short. It's easy to remember, and it's totally unethical. It had nothing to do with his qualifications or anything. It made him sound like an old man that pees his pants, right? And so, in that circumstance, it really worked. But you can see that this knowledge and this approach to communication for persuasion and influence is not just honor bound. It has reference to anybody who wants to use it. The two gurus for the opposite points of view here is a guy by the name of Frank Luntz. He's the one that the Republicans and the conservatives go to to look for the right language and the right approach and the stories and so forth that will persuade people. And the guy that is most influential for this on the liberal side is a guy by the name of George Lakoff, who, when I first read his book, which was a big bestseller, and that's kind of where I came from. He's a cognitive scientist. He's also a neuroscientist, but he is the more or less the guru for the effective liberals. Well, let me also say that if you don't think that this works, I've got the best evidence in the world for you. The reality is that I'm an atheist, but I recognize talent when I see it. Jesus Christ and his disciples convinced and converted half of the known world to Christianity by telling stories. I think there's a message there, and it's something that we have to take into consideration. I would also, because they're kind of in the lawyer field here, point out that the greatest lawyers were the lawyers that told stories. Fallon and Clarence Darrow, and in the current day, Jerry Spence, Dershowitz, and of course, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. He's a great storyteller. Have you seen the movie of Lincoln? At one point in the movie, why he's going to talk to these people, and one of his opponents says, "Well, you're not going to tell us any more of those damn stories, are you?" And this is the point that I would say is the crucial element in all of this. But as I say, it's really a hard sell. Well, so let's talk about telling stories, because telling stories, I did this recently for the 3rd Legislative District PCOs. And, you know, you have to understand that just the stories alone will not do it. And many people don't tell stories very well. And so I think it's really important for all of us that are trying to persuade and influence people to realize that telling stories is really important, and just practicing telling stories is very important. So there's a story about this guy goes to prison, and as soon as he gets there, while they're having their dinner, and he sits down for dinner, and in the process of that, people stand up and they'll call out numbers, 12. Everybody laughs, and somebody will say 22, and everybody laughs, and the guy turns to the person next to him and he says, "What's going on here?" And he says, "Well, we know all the stories, and so we just call out the numbers of the stories, and we don't have to tell the stories." So he thought about that for a minute, and he stands up and he says, 45. Dead silence. He said, "What happened there?" And he said, "Well, some people can tell them and some people can't." And the point being that it really is important how you tell stories. And so if we look at these kinds of things, it's very important for us to understand that how you tell the stories and your choice of stories and so forth can make all the difference in your ability to persuade and influence. So let's realize that the stories don't have to be long stories. I gave you the illustration of McCain, the McCain story, but let's see. Somebody once challenged Ernest Hemingway to tell a story in 10 words. He He says, I can do it in 6, just right off the top. He said, here's the story. For sale, baby shoes, never used. Think about that. Powerful story in 6 words. And so I'm hoping that today we can get some people to tell stories. And I'm going to tell you a story now, and you think about that, and then we'll use that as an example of how to tell stories. Guy goes in, comes home, walks out into the kitchen, and on the refrigerator there's a big sign and message, and it says, "This isn't working. I can't stand it anymore. I've gone to stay with my sister." The guy reaches down, opens the refrigerator door. He says, "The light's on. Beer's cold." What the hell is she talking about? The point being that communication is really important, and you can get problems in communication just by the language that you're using. I'm challenging you with that. Think about that and how I told it, and then we'll have some other people tell that story. Now, there are 2 ways to do this. Obviously, what I've been doing with you is taking a humorous approach to it. And there's something really endearing about that, and I really encourage you to think about that, particularly if you're dealing with people that are very strident. If you can get your discussion partner, not your arguing partner, but your discussion partner, if you can get them to laugh with you, you've already broken the ice and you've been able to communicate better. And so there's something that is very effective about using humorous material to bridge the gap of communication. And then you can also look at it from a different standpoint that I've been kind of interested in recent reading, that telling stories that are amusing are really expressions of love. They transfer your feeling, your empathy to the person that you're talking to. You make them, you extend your palm to them and say, I'm here to entertain you. I'm here to amuse you. I'm not your enemy. I'm your communicating partner here. And so that really helps communication. And I want to say a word or two about empathy too, because it is the key element in all of this. This is what we're really talking about when we're talking about reaching out and being able to communicate with people. Human beings, and not exclusively human beings, there are some animals that also are able to express empathy. Now, empathy is different than compassion and pity and things like this. Empathy is a very, very fundamental element of human existence. When you're empathic, you're putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. You're trying to experience their position from your position. So it's a crucial element here, and empathy is not paid enough attention to. But empathy is really the heart of human communication. And everyone, all human beings are born with empathy, except the autistic and Dick Cheney. But the important thing here to think about is that empathy can be conditioned out of you. And my personal observation would be that, well, first of all, let me say that if you don't have empathy, you really have psychotic problems. if the empathy is the business of being human, it's being able to put yourself in the shoes of other people. And so my contention is that that if that's true, then the Pentagon is filled with psychotics. And I'm not saying that in jest. I mean, I think those are the majority of those people have lost their ability to empathize. And so think about empathy and say to yourself, human beings have the ability to do that. And it also extends into the areas of athletics. And you know, it's very tempting to go into the area of athletics with this because for a long time athletic skills were taught on the basis of mechanics, and now athletic skills are all based on visualization and the idea of trying to mimic the motions of other people rather than just the basic mechanics. And that's very similar to the business of empathy. If you can visualize yourself in somebody else's shoes, that's kind of the same thing as visualizing the golf swing or the tennis swing. That change took place back in the 60s, as a matter of fact, well, maybe 70s. When the Russians were very successful in the Olympics, and they were trying to figure out, well, why is that? Are they cheating or whatever? Of course, that was always a supposition, but it turned out that the Russians had more sports psychologists on staff than coaches, and I would submit that that's pretty much a picture across the board today. Let's see, where were we? Okay, let me give you an example of a serious story, other than the one that I told you about Hemingway. I did a workshop for Pajals a number of years ago now. And I had them come together and share values, and then come back and tell their values to the group. And then I had them go out and out of the room and think of a story, either a personal story or a non-personal story. And this then they came back, and a couple of them told stories. People really like to tell stories. And if you give them a chance and give them the skills, then storytelling can be a very rich experience. In fact, there's a place here in Spokane where they do nothing but tell stories. And I went to that event it's at the Cracker Barrel building down, off of Division. My God, we're 200 or 300 people there, and they were just listening to people tell stories. But anyway, I digress. I had these people come back, and a couple of them told stories. And then this woman, who was probably in her 60s, got up and she said, I want to tell you my story about it. She said, years ago, I was an operating room nurse. And they brought in a woman into the emergency room who had tried to self-abort. And I hope I can get through this. And I was given the duty of disposing of the fetus. And when I came back from doing that, the woman had died on the operating table. And she said, that's when I became pro-choice. And I went back to school. I got into medical school. And I'm an OBGYN now, and I take care of people like that. Now, I'm not saying that if you had told that story to Antonin Scalia when he was alive, that it would have made him pro-choice. But there's a message there, that a compelling story. Oh, by the way, she said, I've never told that story to anyone before. There's a message there that, yes, maybe it doesn't make a difference right then, but you can't unring the bell. That is imprinted in the mind, and it may eventually lead to a change in the belief system. And that's the important thing. And we have to also say that if we're talking about persuading and influencing people, we're also talking about circumstances where the people are able to be influenced in a particular area. Because obviously, people who have a belief system that's been built up over their entire lives and so forth, you're not going to change that belief system, boom, like that. But if you start them on their way and you figure out a way that you can get them to empathize, let me use an illustration of, to get away from politics, Fords and Chevy lovers. Basically, these are people that are very, very tied to their toys, and it's very difficult to get the Ford lover to embrace a Chevrolet. But the key element there would be to get the Ford lover to ride in the Chevrolet, drive the Chevrolet, and have some time in a Chevrolet and so forth, and conceivably it might make him a little more tolerant for Chevrolets. So I'm just using that as an illustration of the fact that you're not going to perhaps make a major change in somebody's belief system right away, but if you plant the seeds, if you think in terms of them looking at this over a period of time, then maybe you become successful in persuading and influencing them. And then I also, in a general sense, ask you to think about prioritization, because for me, as I've been retired for many years, matter of fact, I'm embarrassed to say that in 2018, I will have been retired as long as I worked. But I'm kind of proud of that, actually. But what I have trouble with, and what we all have trouble with, is prioritizing time. It's a huge issue, and it's even more of an issue if you have to make the priorities yourself, and that you don't have a job that you have to go to, and all of those kinds of things. So let me tell you a story. A guy goes to the Super Bowl, and he sits down, and the guy next to him has a vacant seat, and he just can't stand it. After a while, he has to ask, and he says, do you know anything about the vacant seat that's next to you? And the guy says, well, yes, I do. He said, that was my wife's seat, and she died. And he says, well, gee, I'm really sorry to hear that, but don't you have any friends or relatives? And say, well, he says, they're all at the funeral. My point here is that notice, if you're talking about priorities, that puts that whole picture in a little different frame, doesn't it? And then the person could say, well, wow, maybe I am maybe I need to take a look at my priorities. I would close with, and then trying to open this up to more of a discussion because we're kind of running late anyway, that I'd like to close with talking about Clarence Darrow, who is one of my favorite personages, and I read his autobiography. Well, I don't think he wrote an autobiography. I've read a couple of three biographies of Clarence Darrow. But there was a time in his life when he was normally always defending the underdog and the person with, labor situations and so on and so forth, and things that had happened. And he was contracted with two very wealthy families in Chicago to defend their children who had, the two boys, their names were Leopold and Loeb. We know what we're talking about here. And they convinced him to try to get them to get the boys off so that they wouldn't be executed, because there was huge outrage of these rich kids just killing somebody as a thrill, see if they could get away with it. Well, long story short, came down to the final summation of the trial, and they turned it over to Darrow. And his summation to the jury was 10 hours long. Now, what do you think he did? He told stories for 10 hours, and he got them off. The jury just could not say no. So, when we're talking about famous storytellers, one more story. That leads me to this. On a more pleasant note, perhaps. The story of a story was told about Abraham Lincoln, and Rick's heard this story.
So this is a good story.
Yeah, okay.
You've known this one since the first part.
But it's a good story, and it points out how just a story can change the picture in a trial. Abraham Lincoln was trying a case early in his career in Illinois, downstate in Illinois, and he got to the point where the judge said, "Well, now we're going to break for lunch, and when we and don't forget, you're going to tell stories. Don't forget that." We're going to break for lunch, and then, Mr. Lincoln, you can make your summation to the jury after lunch. And so they came back from lunch, and Lincoln and the judge said, "Mr. Lincoln, you may proceed." And he said, "Well, Your Honor, I just think that my learned opponent over here, he's got his facts straight. He just reached the wrong conclusion." The jury laughed, and they huddled, and acquitted his client. And afterward, the attorney came up to him, the prosecutor came up to him, and he said, what was that all about? He said, "Well," Lincoln said, that during lunch I was telling a story about my next-door neighbor. My next-door neighbor said that his son came running up to him the other day, and he said, Pa, he says, "Sister's down at the barn with a hired man, and she's got her skirts up, and he's got his pants down, and they're going to pee in the hay." And he said, "Son, you got your facts straight. You just reached the wrong conclusion." And so with that in mind, think about how just a story like that can diffuse the situation, make the person be amused, and make a connection, and be a much more influential and persuasive person. Thank you.